Hi guys! It's been a while since I did a video, but I was just kind of feeling it this morning, so here we are. I've been going through the book of Judges. I finished up the Gospel of John, as most of you know if you're following. And so I am here in Judges chapter 7. So we're talking about Gideon. And in chapter 6, the previous chapter, he has just asked for, of course, the sign of the fleece, which most people do know that story. But, God has called him to lead the people of Israel, to save the people of Israel from their enemies. And, of course, Gideon is a very unlikely candidate for this job. When God meets him, he's hiding, doing his work, threshing wheat, and he's hiding in the winepress to do it because he's afraid of the enemies. So that's when God calls him. He's an unlikely candidate, but God has now confirmed this calling by giving Gideon supernatural signs that he, of course, has asked for, and God mercifully, graciously gave them. He obliged Gideon. He waited for Gideon, and it's just a really beautiful picture of God's grace and mercy. But so now Gideon, the least in his father's house, hailing from the weakest tribe, is going to save Israel, right? This is who God has chosen. Isn't that great? So little wonder, though, why the guy asked for a few supernatural signs before just diving into this little journey. But dive he did. So go Gideon, right? Gideon had already torn down his father's idol god at God's command. Now, this was quite something. This was the preceding chapter as well. And so the townspeople, the men of the town are angry because Gideon has basically busted down their false god that they worshipped. He did it at night because he was afraid to do it in the day. So they've given him this nickname, Jerubbaal, which literally meant let Baal, who was the false idol god that they were worshiping, let Baal fight against him. This is what they're calling him now, right? Because Gideon's father's friends wanted to kill him because he did this, because he broke down their idol. The men of his very own town were counting on their false god at this point to contend with Gideon for destroying their idols. Okay? So they wanted to kill him, but Gideon's dad said, no, don't kill him. If this is really a god, then he'll avenge himself. And so this just doesn't say a lot for Gideon's reputation now with even his own people at this point, right? So that's where we're starting with this guy. But anyway, Gideon asks God for some signs, of course, and God obliges him. And then he sets out to obey God and fight Israel's oppressive enemies, who were, at this point in time, the Midianites, with 32,000 men. Okay, so Gideon sets out with 32,000 men. And there's only one problem with that. God wants all the credit for the victory that Gideon's about to win here. And he wants all the credit for the saving of Israel through Gideon. That's why he chose Gideon, the most unlikely guy, right? He didn't choose like some big, strong, courageous guy. He chose this weakest, least of these guy that's afraid, right? This little mouse of a man. He chooses Gideon. And so he wants the credit, and Gideon's got way too many men for this to go well for God, right? He's like, everybody's going to say the army did it, right? We don't want that. So God tells Gideon some more good news. He says, you got to get rid of some of your guys, right? Just get rid of some of your army. Like, well, how do you think Gideon felt when God said that, right? So get this, let's just recap here for a moment so we really get this. One day, you're threshing wheat while hiding in a wine press from your neighboring enemy guys who you're terrified of meeting up with, right? And the next day, God is telling you, you're the guy who's going to lead your entire people in victory over those guys that you're afraid of, right? So after a string of supernatural events confirming God's directives to you, you set out with an army of 32,000 men, strong men at that, behind you. So you're feeling pretty good about this, and you're just about to get going on your war against these fierce and feared enemies when God says, wait a minute, you got way too many guys here. I got to get rid of some of them before you go. So we can't have you getting any of the glory for this, Gideon, right? So you got it? So even a little guy who's not looking for glory like Gideon may, have a tendency to get puffed up with pride if he would win this battle, right? Like, oh, I did this, right? But God's like, that's not going to happen, right? Because we're going to get rid of some of these guys for you, so you have to trust me. You have to trust me fully. And so any guy with half a grain of common sense has got to be feeling a little bit compromised at this point, right? But Gideon humbly obeys God. That's amazing, right? He did exactly what God said. He told his guys that if they were scared, they should go home. He tells his army this, right? If you're scared, go home, right? And guess how many left the army at that point? 22,000 of his 32,000 men left because they were afraid. More than 2/3 of Gideon's army left when he told those who were afraid to go home. Why? Why? Because I can bet you that Gideon was afraid too. In fact, I know he was when you read on in the text. Why did they leave? Because scared people don't usually fight. And if they do go to war, they either desert or they don't fight fully. They're afraid. Fearful people don't fight well, right? And I think, as I studied this morning, that's really a timely thought. It really is for our day here. This right here, the fact that scared people don't fight well, or they don't fight at all, or they desert, that's something right now today that we all ought to consider deeply as we march toward the imminent death of our God-given freedoms. Fearful, afraid, scared people generally do not fight well. They don't fight a good war. They desert and go home if given any opportunity to do so. So, something to keep in mind. So, 2/3 of Gideon's army leaves. And God says, okay, good, let's go, right? Nope. He says, well, there's still too many guys here. Right? What does Gideon have to be thinking right now? Take them to the water, God says, and I'll let you know who gets to go and who gets to stay, right? And so God determines this by how they drink the water, whether they're on their knees or they lap it from their hands. And Gideon does exactly what God says. Gideon obeys. He sends the guys home that God says to send home. And notice, when you read this text, Gideon does not argue with God. He doesn't whine about losing his men or fret about what he's going to do without them. He doesn't banter with God about, why are you taking away the men that are going to help me, God, my support, right? My soldiers, what are you doing, God? Like, you don't hear that from Gideon. And I just have to say, he's a better guy than I am, because that's all I do. When God starts disadvantaging me, for whatever reason, I don't look at it like, oh, good God, you're going to get the glory and I'm not, right? No, like, we argue with God. We're like, what are you doing here? Like, none of this makes any sense. And Gideon very well could have done that. There's so many pieces of this Gideon puzzle where he could have been like, God, this doesn't make sense. But Gideon doesn't do that. He's just obeying, right? He's trusting in God. And he's afraid. Let's remember that part. But Gideon knows something that I think we as God's children often tend to forget, especially when God starts taking things away from us that we think we really need, right? And maybe we don't need them. Gideon didn't. He only needed his trust in God. But from a human standpoint, God was taking away the things that were his support structure, right? His men. So here's the thing though. Gideon knows that he's not saving the world alone. He's not single-handed in this, right? God is the one saving. And God is saving Gideon's people through him, right? God is saving his own people through Gideon. And so Gideon's got that right. Gideon's not saving the world. Gideon's trusting God to use him in his plan of salvation for the world. And if we could just get that, we would be where Gideon is, in obedience and trust and in faith. And, I'm preaching to myself here. That is a take-home from this passage of Judges 7. So, but someone out there needs to hear this, and we got to get this. This is a message for me. It's a message for my brothers and sisters, all of us, who feel often abandoned by those who we thought were glory bound and bringing home the win with us, right? Our fellow soldiers. And they're leaving. They're saying, I'm scared, I'm going home. Or God's saying, those aren't the guys that are going with you. I'm sending them home. And sometimes that can get really, really hard and confusing and hurtful. But we need to take Gideon's example and not argue with God and not banter with God, but trust God. So, and as I was reading this, I just thought, I bet there's a lot of church leading brothers and sisters right now feeling the pain of isolation and pioneering alone through this pandemic, or seemingly alone, because it can feel really lonely when you're not gathering together, right? Take it from one who knows. Who thought maybe that they had a lot more tried and true troops trailing behind them. And maybe this, I don't know what to call it, maybe purification of the church here, as we're seeing who the remnant really is kind of revealing the fact that we may have far less people than what we really thought we had when it really comes down to it, and when the rubber really meets the road. And so I think it's a story of Gideon, and God is saying, these are your guys. You thought you had 32,000, but you've got 300, and guess what? You're still going to win. I'm going to win. I'm bringing this to you. So, like I said, 300. Guess how many Gideon got? 300. He got 300 men out of the 32,000 he started with. Gideon got 300. Consider that, because when he set out, he thought he had 32,000. He did. God took them away for his own glory. And Gideon didn't argue, because Gideon knew he wasn't saving the world alone or single-handedly. God was saving Gideon's people through him. God wanted the glory, and the highly unfavorable odds stacked against Gideon gave God the glory. So just look what God does in the end here. God literally takes thousands of men away from his leading soldier. Makes no sense, right? And leaves only a very scarce few. And then he says to Gideon, in Judges 7, 9 through 11, he says, arise, go down against the camp, that's the enemies, for I have given it into your hand. All right, so God encourages him, says, the battle's won, you're going to get it, you're going to have victory, right? But if you're afraid to go down, now this just shows us how tender-hearted God is toward our struggles, toward our weaknesses. God says, I've given you this victory, right? But if you're afraid, if you're still afraid to go down against your enemies and take this victory right now, go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you're going to hear what they're saying. And afterwards, your hands will be strengthened to go down against the camp. So God's saying, you're going to win, Gideon. I'm going to give you this victory. But if you're still afraid, take a friend with you and go listen to what they're saying in the enemy's camp before you go fight them. And so we can infer from the text that Gideon is indeed still afraid, because he takes his friend down to the enemy's camp and he just so happens to overhear a dream of one of the enemy men and the interpretation of it. So his enemies were speaking about a dream about where God was giving the land of Midian into Gideon's hand. Isn't that ironic, right? He just happens to hear this, right? And so, it's one thing when your friends are pep talking you by encouraging your hoped for success, right? But it's quite another thing when you overhear your enemies talking about how you yourself are going to beat them by God's mighty hand. Now, so Gideon hears this and he knows that it's God. He knows this is confirmation, right, from God. And so when he hears this dream and interpretation concerning his victory from his enemies, he immediately worships God, right? He worshiped God. He took no pride. What would you think if you stumbled upon someone who you knew hated you saying that you're going to beat them? There's an opportunity for pride there. Gideon could have really taken it upon himself and just said, yeah, I'm going to win, right? Like, even my enemies are saying how great I am. Like, he could have really allowed that to give him to pride, but he didn't do that. Instead, he worshiped God. He saw it as confirmation, encouragement for him to go and to take that victory. And I think if he had allowed that to swell up his pride, he may not have had the victory that he had. But anyway, that's another story for another day. He worships God before he fights the battle because he knows he's going to win. Now that's something we got to get down deep in our soul, right? Gideon had not won yet. He hadn't even fought yet. He had just lost most of his army. He had a few scarce men left to even fight this war with. He had not won anything. But Gideon knows, because he trusts God. After his calling to lead an army against a fierce and numerous enemy, had all his men retracted, almost all of them, all but 300, Gideon was facing impossible odds, and the text implies that he's clearly afraid, but Gideon believes God. He believes God. He obeys God. He trusts God, and he worships God before he goes out to this battle. So, Gideon goes back to his own camp. He gets his 300 men, and he gets ready to fight. And do you know what he took for this battle against this fierce enemy? He didn't take guns and knives. He took non-traditional weapons. He took torches and trumpets. What? What's that going to do, right? That's what he took. He took torches and trumpets. He took his tried and true few to blow the trumpets on all sides of the enemy's camp. He told them to shout for the Lord and for Gideon. They broke the glasses which held the torches. And we can see here that their whole strategy when facing this fierce enemy, far more numerous than they were, was what? To make some noise. To make themselves be known, right? And that's what they did. Not a bad strategy, I guess. The enemy was so afraid that they turned their swords upon each other, and God won. Gideon won. Ephraim came to his aid and killed 2 enemy kings, and the guy they nicknamed, "Let Our Idol God Fight Against Him," fought their fiercest enemies and won with nothing more than a few faithful men and a heart full of faith in God. So we need to get that. We need to read that again, right? God wants all the glory, and that's what this story is all about. He gets it by using the fearful, the disadvantaged, the unlikely to lead Gideons of the world. So it's not too hard to be one of those. I'm one of those, right? I'm definitely a Gideon. So he wants the glory. We just have to obey and to trust him. And the beauty of this, the mercy and the grace of it, is that he allows us to test him when we're afraid. He allows us to ask for confirmation, and he gives it to us so that we will be encouraged, right? Because it's kind of hard when most of your army gets taken away and you're supposed to go fight. God will encourage us because he wants the glory. And so, I don't know. I think it's a timely message, and that's kind of why I'm sharing it today. I hope that it's helpful for someone out there. And anyway, subscribe to my blog, and I will see you later. Thanks for listening.